Tying an electoral strategy to Trump could backfire for Flavio Bolsonaro. This is an assessment by Malu Gaspar from Globo, who is saying the following. He latched onto Trump thinking he would only get advantages, right? But then when Trump comes with tariffs, when Trump starts going after Brazilian companies, this will directly affect Flavio Bolsonaro's campaign. Because who is Trump's friend? It's Flavio. Flavio is the ally. He's the one that, in fact, Marco Rubens hinted needs to win the election. He didn't mention Flavio's name, but he said he hopes there will be changes in the Brazilian election, a change in leadership in Brazil, meaning he's betting that Flavio will win the election, right? So like that, we can perfectly understand the undertones of what Marco Rubens is saying. So this closeness, any backlash that happens, because Brazilians know very well who Trump is. He gets involved, he likes to stick his nose where he's not invited. Wanting to invade other territories, wanting to dominate other territories, other countries. He wants everyone to follow his rules, right? So Brazilians aren't happy either. Trump has a terrible image in Brazil. A terrible image in Brazil. It's only not as bad as the image he has inside the United States. Because there, only 37% of Americans approve of Trump's administration. 60% disapprove. So his image there is terrible. Right? And well, his image here isn't much better either. So Brazilians, if they notice this connection, this link between Flavio Bolsonaro and Donald Trump, they know that this connection harms Brazil. And Brazilians aren't fools. They'll notice and turn their attention to Flavio Bolsonaro, who's responsible for all of this. BBC News Brazil also has an assessment similar to Malu Gasparo's assessment. It's still unclear whether Trump's interventions will help or hinder Flavio Bolsonaro, says the New York Times. The New York Times, the most important newspaper in the world, published some articles in which it says, look, it even gave the example of Canada. Right, Trump kept bothering the Prime Minister. What happened? In Canada, the opposition was going to win the election, but in the end, the ruling party's candidate won the election because he stood up to Trump. In Hungary, he did everything to keep Viktor Orban in power. But the opposition led this, brought Trump into the conversation, said, look, see here, Trump, this outsider, is trying to interfere here, and the people didn't like it. Viktor Orban lost, right? So it's still not clear whether Flavio has something to gain or to lose. Right? For me, he has much more to lose because of Trump's negative image and because of the things he's been doing that harm Brazil. Including the PCC and Comando Vermelho on terrorism-related sanctions lists brings risks and costs to companies in the country. This is where it gets tricky for Flavio Bolsonaro. Because the businessmen are all supporters of Flavio Bolsonaro, right? Now they're going to have to pay the price for being supporters because it's going to fall on their shoulders. What happens? Why does this happen? It affects the companies because the financial system is affected. The banks are affected. The American government can simply decide to go after a Brazilian bank because they say, no, that bank has terrorists who have accounts there. So that bank is providing services to terrorists. I'm going to sanction that bank and will punish. But how do you sanction it? Almost the entire Brazilian financial system, practically the whole Brazilian financial system, has ties with the United States. Why? Because they trade in dollars, they trade stocks, right, on the stock exchange, buying and selling dollars. There are transactions and ties with the United States, with branches, with institutions that are connected to these banks here in Brazil. If a bank is punished there in the United States, it could, for example, be prohibited from buying dollars. So what do? It could, for example, be prohibited from having a branch in the United States. It could face legal action in the United States courts. So what will it have to do? It will have to have extremely strict control over who its clients are, who moves money, where it goes, and where it comes from, right? All that money. Why? Because if the United States decides to go after it, it doesn't matter which bank it is. It could be the biggest bank. At Itaú, there are clients who are from the PCC. How is the bank supposed to know that in many cases? Of course, there are situations where there are suspicious financial transactions and the bank actually takes action, right? The banks act that way to eliminate that risk. Now, can I be a bank that has a client who's from the PCC? I don't know. But the United States, simply out of spite, because that's what it is, right? Why? Out of spite. Because they want to favor the American financial system to the detriment of the Brazilian financial system. Out of spite, they can simply nitpick. So the bank doesn't suffer this kind of sanction, they're going to monitor everything. And then that PIX that was supposedly going to be monitored, which was Nicholas's lie, could become true. The bank, not because of the government's initiative, but because of the bank's own initiative. Because the bank is under pressure, it's being squeezed by decisions over there in the United States. So they might start doing really strict monitoring of the money you move around. Through PICs, through bank transfers, the money you receive, the money you send, then yes, you will be watched. Got it? Because the bank, to avoid sanctions, will watch everyone. So now you've got PICs being monitored thanks to Flavio Bolsonaro, right? Nicolas's story was a lie, but it could become true now. It really could. At any moment, actually, all it takes is for the United States to want to crack down and do something about it. The BBC News Brazil article. What happened in Mexico, Colombia, and Venezuela after organizations were designated as terrorist organizations by the United States? So, let's break it down. In Mexico, two things happened. It was already discovered that there was a secret CIA operation inside Mexican territory. And they found out how. There was a car accident, 2 people died. When the authorities went to identify these 2 people, they discovered that they were 2 secret agents from the United States who were working on Mexican territory without Mexico's knowledge. So, this is an invasion of sovereignty, right? That's the point of what happened with Mexico. Another thing that happened with Mexico, Mexican banks were prohibited from operating with the United States. That's what I just told you could happen with Brazil. It happened there. And there is strong pressure on President Claudia Sheinbaum precisely because of the United States' entry into Mexican territory without authorization. Then you might say, but isn't there a law that prevents this? Yes, here in Brazil, right? Over there in the United States, their law allows them to invade other people's territory if there's a terrorist there. So all they have to do is classify someone as a terrorist. And I'm authorized by the law of my country, in this case, the United States, to invade other countries. But Brazil can't allow that. And what is Brazil going to do? Are they going to send the soldiers who are experts at painting curbs like no one else? Who know how to paint tree trunks only halfway up? Are they going to fight with a paintbrush in their hands? Because here's the thing, if an aircraft carrier shows up on the Brazilian coast, what are we going to do? We don't have enough ammo to last half an hour in a firefight, so obviously if they try, they'll succeed. What happened in Venezuela? The most concrete example of political interference in a country, that's all that happened there, right? Because they classified the organizations as terrorist, started getting closer to the Caribbean, doing those actions where they blew up boats, which they say, right? Because they're still doing it. They say those are traffickers' boats. And then they took advantage of this approach to Venezuelan territory to make an incursion there and kidnap Nicolas Maduro. Simply kidnap the president, just take him to the United States and put the guy on trial in a process that has absolutely nothing to do with reality. They say the guy is a drug dealer, an arms dealer. That has absolutely no correlation with reality. But he's there, prosecuted, he's there in prison. And now Venezuela has another president in his place who's doing the will of the United States. So it was a direct political interference, thanks to this classification as a terrorist organization. In Colombia, there were also actions at sea, and now there's a threat to do the same thing with Petro as they did with Maduro. In other words, to remove Petro from there. They started claiming that Gustavo Petro, the Colombian president, also had connections, right? That he also had connections with drug trafficking, with the drug trade, with criminal factions that they call terrorists and so on. Trump has been saying that. So Gustavo Petro himself is afraid of suffering the same consequences as Nicolas Maduro, being kidnapped by another country. So those were the results of this classification in other countries. So in Brazil, this sanction could be imposed on banks and Brazilian companies. And we could face military actions, covert actions, or even not so covert actions on Brazilian territory. So this is the risk we face from now on, the risk of direct intervention by the United States. There's one, if you missed the live stream on how to build wealth after 50, there will be a replay this Sunday, okay? There will be a replay exclusively here on the channel. You can watch, you can learn because the class is free, right? And you can follow along. It's a very important class by Eduardo Moreira to teach you how to invest properly and build wealth after 50. And I've got my eye on this class. I was one of those who missed the first class. But I won't miss the second one, no. So actually, I'm going to leave a message for you here from Eduardo Moreira. But before that, I'm going to say goodbye to you. I really appreciate your patience. We've already been here for an hour and 7 minutes discussing politics. Thank you for your kindness, affection, the super chat, and your attention. I'm leaving, but I'll be back at any moment with more news about politics, justice, and the economy of Brazil and the world. Big hug to you. Hey, chum. Hugs? Oh. Thanks, folks.
I recently turned 50 years old on February 11th.
Hey everyone, I really wanted to thank you all
for the happy birthday wishes.
And this date really got to me. It gives me a bit of that feeling, wow, how am I going to make the most of this second half of my life? Funny, right? Second half, as if we were going to live that long. The expectation is that we live a little less. But maybe it really is the second half, because we start to take control of our own path and understand life, not on the day we're born, but when we're a little older. So yes, the second half. And one of the things that inevitably came up as a concern was how I was going to start taking care of my finances from now on so I can have a good second half. Maybe even still accumulating a little bit of wealth so I can just enjoy it later, right? Enjoy that moment that I think everyone should enjoy in that last third of life. And I decided to share all these thoughts with you in a class that I'm going to call Flavio Dug His Own Grave. Trump's sanctions shrink business and he makes a fool of himself. You'll be able to understand how I organize my finances and how I make sure this financial balance is maintained as I move through different cities. It's free to participate and you'll learn a lot from what I'm going to teach.